You know what your problem is, Jaden? You spent 9 years pretending to be a man with a plan, and all you ever had was that tired Accord and a savings account that wouldn't cover my shoes. You were never enough. Not for this life. Not for me. And the saddest part? You actually thought you were. She said that in the courthouse hallway. Loud, deliberate, performed, the way Cassandra performed everything, for an audience she'd already assembled in her head. Her attorney looked at the floor. A court clerk near the filing window suddenly found something urgent to study on her computer screen. And I stood there and let every word land without flinching, because I'd been waiting 9 years for her to finally say out loud what she'd been thinking. My name is Jaden Wilson, 38 years old, Shreveport, Louisiana born. My father was a postal worker who wore the same Timex for 19 years because it still worked. Above our kitchen sink, he kept a piece of cardboard, black marker, yellowed at the edges. What you have is your business, not theirs. I didn't understand it at 8. Standing in that hallway, I understood every syllable. But here's what Cassandra didn't know, what nobody in that building knew except one quiet attorney on the 3rd floor and my Uncle Terrence sitting in the back row in a navy jacket. The number the judge was about to read aloud would change the temperature of that hallway completely. And I hadn't said a word yet. Please, before I continue, kindly like, share, and subscribe for more interesting stories. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday. I was eating toast, plain wheat, no butter, and I finished it before I opened the envelope. My father taught me that panic was just information you hadn't organized yet. So I read every page twice, slowly, like a man reviewing a contract he'd already anticipated. Cassandra's attorney had listed the marital assets with the confidence of someone who believed they had the full picture. The Prairieville house, the joint savings account, $34,000, and the Accord. That was her entire map of my life. $34,000 in a car with a cracked dashboard. I set the papers down and sat with the silence for a moment. Then something happened that I hadn't expected. I almost laughed. Not cruelly, just the quiet, disbelieving laugh of a man who realizes the person who shared his bed for 9 years had never once been curious enough to ask a single real question about how he spent his days. My phone buzzed. Terrence. I picked up. He said, "You got Raymond?" I said yes. There was a pause. Then finish your toast. He hung up. I looked at the papers one more time. $34,000. I thought about the 11 properties sitting in 3 LLCs with no Wilson in their names anywhere. I picked up my toast. I finished it. I knew something had shifted 14 months before she filed. Not a dramatic moment. No slammed door. No tearful confession. Something quieter and more final than that. She stopped being curious about me. Not gradually. It was like a switch. One week she was asking about my day. The next week she wasn't. And the week after that she'd already stopped noticing. She'd stopped asking. Then came the Instagram posts. Cassandra had always loved the performance of living. But these posts had a different energy. A weekend in New Orleans she called a girls' trip. A restaurant I didn't recognize. A photo where someone's arm was cropped out just slightly too carefully. I noticed. I didn't say anything. I called Terrence on a Sunday evening, and he spoke for 4 minutes, describing what he'd observed the same way he'd describe a structural problem on a job site. No drama, just the facts and where the weakness was. I thanked him. We never brought it up again. That night, I went to my home office, sat down at my desk, pulled out a legal pad, and wrote down every asset I owned. Every property. Every LLC, every account number. And I sat back and looked at the list for a long time. Then I picked up the phone and called Raymond Cole. He answered on the second ring. He said, "I was wondering when you'd call." Raymond Cole's office had no sign outside, just a suite number on the 3rd floor of a building that looked like it handled insurance disputes. His waiting room had 2 chairs and a dead plant he'd never replaced. He told me once that his clients didn't come for atmosphere. They came because in 22 years, he had never lost a high-asset case where opposing counsel underestimated his preparation. He said it the way a level says a table is flat, not bragging, just reporting. When I slid my legal pad across his desk, 11 properties, 3 LLCs, every account, he didn't react. He studied it the way a surgeon studies a scan. Then, does she know any of this? No. He nodded once. Does anyone? Just Terrence. He nodded again, slower. Here's what we do. We let her attorney build their entire case on what your wife thinks you have. We respond to every discovery request truthfully and precisely. Nothing volunteered, nothing concealed. Then at the hearing, we submit the full disclosure. He straightened the legal pad and pushed it back across the desk. Let them assume. Assumptions are expensive. I drove home in the Accord. The crack in the dashboard caught the late afternoon light the way it always did. I left it. I needed it to stay exactly the way it was. A little longer. Derek Calloway was the kind of man who understood the theater of wealth and performed it at a level that most people never thought to question. Terrence described him once. Tall, Rolex, the type who picked up restaurant checks loudly enough for neighboring tables to notice. He sold luxury cars. He leased his apartment. The Rolex, Terrence confirmed through a contact at the dealership, was on a payment plan. I never met Derek. I never needed to. What I felt when I first heard his name wasn't rage. It was something colder and more clarifying than that. Because here was a man who saw Cassandra and assumed she was attached to money. And here was Cassandra, who saw Derek and assumed he had it. Two people performing wealth at each other like mirrors facing mirrors. Infinite reflections of nothing behind the glass. I thought about my father's sign. I thought about the Accord in the parking lot. I thought about the property I closed on 3 weeks before Cassandra filed. A 12-unit in Denham Springs that I'd gotten $40,000 on a market because I'd been patient and the seller needed to move fast. I thought about the courtroom date Raymond had circled in red on his desk calendar. And for the first time since the papers arrived, I felt something settle inside my chest. Not happiness, not victory, just patience. The deep, architectural kind that only gets built by men who learned early to build in silence. The morning of the hearing, I woke at 5:30 without an alarm. I ironed the plain gray suit, not my best one. My best one stayed in the closet. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and looked out at the backyard one final time. The peach tree was out there, taller than I expected it to be now. I had planted it in our second year of marriage because Cassandra had mentioned once, almost in passing, barely a full sentence, that her grandmother had one in her yard in Baton Rouge. She never mentioned it again. I don't think she remembered saying it. But I had gone to the nursery that Saturday and bought the smallest one they had. I planted it myself, back corner of the yard, and never made a thing of it. 7 years later, it was tall and full and heavy with the kind of quiet evidence that doesn't care whether it gets acknowledged. I stood at the window and looked at it until my coffee went lukewarm. Then I picked up my keys. Terrence was already in the courthouse parking lot when I arrived. Navy jacket, hands in pockets, saying nothing. We walked in together. Cassandra arrived 11 minutes later with Brenda Hayes, already talking, already performing certainty. She glanced at me once in the hallway, smiled. The way someone smiles when they believe the outcome is already written. It was just not the way she'd written it. Brenda Hayes had constructed a competent case around an incomplete truth. I watched her in that courtroom and felt no anger. She had worked with what Cassandra gave her, and Cassandra had given her a middle-class husband with a cracked dashboard and a joint savings account. Brenda's discovery requests had been standard. Raymond's responses had been precise, truthful, fully compliant, and surgically scoped to exactly what was asked. Nothing volunteered. The architecture of patience made visible. Cassandra sat at her table with the posture of a woman who had already mentally deposited the settlement. Her phone was face down on the table's edge. I knew that habit. Face down meant something felt imminent. She was saving herself for the announcement she'd make right after. The caption was already written somewhere in her head. Raymond sat beside me and wrote on his legal pad in small, unhurried letters. He didn't look up during Brenda's opening remarks. He didn't look up when the expected asset total was presented. The house, the Accord, the account, a figure that landed somewhere just above $200,000. Cassandra nodded subtly. Her posture said, "Finally." Raymond kept writing. He had told me once, "The courtroom is theater. Our job is to wait for the last act." I looked at the clock on the wall. 40 seconds, maybe less. Judge Patricia Okafor had 14 years on the family court bench and a reputation that Raymond had described in 4 words. She reads everything first. She had received our full asset disclosure at 4:58 the previous afternoon, 2 minutes before the clerk's office closed. Raymond had texted me the timestamp like a man who understood that timing was its own form of argument. When Judge Okafor looked up from the bench that morning, she looked at Raymond first, then Brenda, then for exactly 2 seconds at me. I held it. She looked back at her papers. Brenda had just finished presenting the marital assets summary, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of a woman who believed she knew the full inventory. The number she'd cited hung in the air. Cassandra's attorney folded her hands. And then Judge Okafor said, in a tone as flat and precise as a weather report, "Before we proceed, I want to address the full asset disclosure submitted by Respondent's counsel yesterday evening." She turned a page. One page. The sound of it was very small in that room. Brenda Hayes' hands, which had just been folded neatly on the table, stopped moving entirely. Cassandra's phone lit up underneath her palm, a notification she didn't check, because she was watching the judge's mouth now, very carefully, the way you watch something when you suddenly aren't sure what it's about to say. Judge Okafor read the number the way my father read scripture. No performance, no pause for effect, just the words and the weight they carried on their own. She stated the verified net worth first, then the real estate portfolio, then the combined figure. 4.1 million in verified personal holdings, 2.3 million in documented real estate assets across 3 LLCs. On the outside, I was still, completely still, hands flat on the table, eyes forward, breathing the same way I'd been breathing since I sat down. That was the outside. On the inside, something I will only admit here, only to you, for one single second, one half-breath of a moment, I heard my father's voice. Not a memory. His actual voice, the specific way it sounded when he was proud of something and refused to show it, that quiet roughness in the back of his throat. And my eyes went hot, just for that second. Then it passed, and the stillness came back, and I was stone again. I did not look at Cassandra. I had decided that weeks ago, and I kept the decision. I looked at Raymond's legal pad. He had stopped writing. His pen was down. In 22 years of high-asset divorce cases, Raymond Cole had stopped writing exactly once before. He told me that later. I believed him. Behind me, from Cassandra's direction, came a sound I had no word for then, and have no word for now. Something between a breath and the beginning of a question that never finished forming. The recess lasted 20 minutes. I stood at the window at the end of the corridor and watched the parking lot below. A delivery truck was double parked. A woman kept overcorrecting, trying to parallel park, pulling out, trying again. Normal life, moving forward, completely indifferent to what had just shifted inside this building. I was grateful for that, the indifference of ordinary Tuesday afternoons. Terrence came and stood beside me. We were quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Your daddy would have just nodded." That was all. I nodded. We stood there until the clerk called us back in. I heard through the corridor that Brenda Hayes had requested a continuance to review the submitted financials. Judge Okafor had denied it. Everything had been filed in full procedural compliance. The hearing would proceed. When I passed back through the courtroom doorway, I allowed myself one glance, just one, toward Cassandra's table. She wasn't performing anymore. The posture was gone. The phone was still face down, but her hand wasn't on it. She was doing a different kind of math now. A desperate, backward-looking kind. Recalculating 9 years through a lens she hadn't known she needed. Somewhere in that calculation, I imagined, was a car dealership. A payment plan Rolex. A man who was about to answer her calls very differently starting today. Raymond was methodical through the remainder of the hearing the way surgeons are methodical. Nothing wasted, nothing performed. He walked the court through each LLC, each property, each account with the unhurried certainty of a man who had organized this information so thoroughly that even its complexity felt inevitable. 4 months of preparation. 4 months of quiet, documented, airtight work while Cassandra was drafting Instagram captions and Derek Calloway was making payment arrangements on a watch. Brenda Hayes objected twice, valuation methodology on 2 of the properties. Raymond responded in 6 sentences each time. Judge Okafor sustained him on both. I watched Cassandra's hands during this stretch. She had stopped managing them. They sat flat on the table, slightly apart, the way hands look when the person they belong to has stopped thinking about how they appear. Her mother had raised her to always look composed in public. Even her hands had forgotten that instruction. My father had raised me to build quietly and let the building speak when it was time. I had spent 14 years building in silence, in the margins of a life that looked ordinary from the outside, in LLCs with no Wilson in their names, in a backyard with a peach tree nobody noticed, in that fluorescent-lit courtroom in Baton Rouge. Everything I had built in silence was standing up and speaking in full sentences. And the room had gone very, very quiet to hear it. The settlement was signed and filed before 5 o'clock. Louisiana law entitled Cassandra to her fair share of what was genuinely marital. The jointly held property, the account, a proper valuation of our shared years. She received it. Raymond had ensured that everything predating the marriage and everything structured in the LLCs was documented as non-marital beyond any reasonable challenge. It was clean. It was fair. It was finished. I walked to the Accord as the sun dropped behind the tree line. Same car, same cracked dashboard, same 5-year-old machine that had told Cassandra everything she thought she needed to know about me. Terrence hugged me once, hard, brief, the kind of hug that carries a whole language, and walked his own car. I sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. Not from sadness, from intention. I wanted to feel the full weight of the ending before I drove into whatever came next. My phone buzzed. Raymond, well done. No punctuation. Very him. I started the car. On the drive home, I passed the street where I'd bought my first duplex at 24 years old. It looked exactly the same. I thought about the peach tree in the backyard of the Prairieville house, the one planted for a woman who never thought to look for it. Then I thought about my father's sign, yellowed at the edges, black marker above the kitchen sink. What you have is your business, not theirs. I had learned it at 8. I had lived it at 38. And somewhere in a Baton Rouge courtroom, a woman who thought she knew exactly what I had finally understood. She had never known me at all.